All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we try to check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses and tour de forces, and mostly coming from obscure sources. And we hope that this helps you with your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And we are doing a series of Bible decodes. This is number 266. We've been exploring the suppressed Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. In my mind, a very, very devastating and very explanatory theory. It just seems to explain everything. And the evidence, in my opinion, is overwhelming, both circumstantial and direct. And it just makes sense, especially when you put it into a 21st century truther context, where everything is a psyop. Well, we must consider that these psyops didn't just start with the Kennedy assassination. They didn't just start with Pearl Harbor. They didn't just start with the Federal Reserve. They didn't just start with the, post-Civil War amendments and the incorporation of the United States Corporation. They didn't just start with the Declaration of Independence. They started way back to so-called Adam and Eve. And in the first century, the psyopers extraordinaire were the Roman government. And they are the ones who wrote the New Testament. Not a bunch of illiterate Aramaic-speaking fishermen, followers of Jesus in Judea, but the highly literate and schooled, bilingual in Roman and Latin and Greek, with a ton of resources to spare and major motives. The Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who were in charge of the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And they had just gotten done fighting against the Jews in a war, 66 to 73 AD. And Titus and Vespasian were both generals in that war. Titus took over for Vespasian in 69 AD when Vespasian became the new emperor. But we must put this into context, because first of all, Titus and Vespasian were both wounded in this war. Titus and Vespasian had both witnessed the long-standing and heard about the long-standing resistance of the Jews going all the way back to 63 BC. One uprising after a revolt, after an insurrection, after a war, after a revolution, non-stop practically for 125 years. And also recognizing that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah from the Old Testament scriptures, a Jewish Messiah who was going to be a military commander and help the Jews to overthrow the Romans, which to a certain extent they did in 66 AD with this beginning of this war, where a few self-proclaimed messiahs did overthrow the Herod puppet king from Rome called Herod Agrippa II, and sent him packing back to Rome. that caused Emperor Nero to bring in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. Now, meanwhile, this was the very beginning of the Roman Civil War. And so when Vespasian finally got the call in 69 AD to become the new emperor, he had to be shuddering a little bit, because this was within the last 12 or so months before this, Emperor Nero was assassinated and was replaced by Emperor Galba, who was assassinated, who was replaced by Emperor Otho, who was assassinated, who was replaced by Emperor Vitellius, who was assassinated. And then they gave the call to Vespasian. So you have to think that he was a little bit concerned about the stability of his reign and wanted to shore up his position. And one of the ways that he could do that was to come up with this psychological operation where he instead proposed a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's heavy backpack, and turning the other cheek to oppression. And so at the same time that this Jewish Messiah was going to the outer court of the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers, and throwing out the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the sacrifice in the temple. So Jesus is going after the Jews and their traditions and religions. When he recruited his disciples, he demanded that they abandon their families. Jewish disciples and Jewish families abandoned. And at the same time, he's completely deferential to the Romans. And then when we venture further into the New Testament, into the Pauline epistles, we find that Paul is even more deferential to the Romans than Jesus was. And Paul is even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. And we have to wonder, this seems to raise a red flag. How is this? How could this be? Well, when we look into it a little bit further, we see that the Romans not only had that very strong motive to mellow out the Jews, or to tame or domesticate the Jews in the language that they use, but also a great deal of other circumstantial evidence, including their method of operation. The Romans had created other religions just at this very time in order to psychologically manipulate other groups of people, including other groups of Jews. For example, the Pharisaic Jews were manipulated by the opening of the campus at Jaffna by a land grant given by Vespasian to Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was really the founder of Rabbinic Judaism. The Rabbinic Judaism school was explicitly founded by the Flavians. And the Romans were the only people who had the means and the opportunity to do this, given that they had complete control over censorship, publishing, and distribution in the empire. Nobody was writing anything in the Roman Empire unless it was approved of by Caesar. And The New Testament is written in Greek, one of the two primary languages of the Romans. Not so much in Judea, where they were speaking Aramaic and barely writing at all. And then, to get to the direct evidence, we have to open up another book in addition to these scriptures, which is a book that came out under the auspices of the Romans, under the authorship of a person named Flavius, from the Flavians, Flavius Josephus, or Josephus. And this is a history in 7 volumes of the war between the Romans and the Jews. It's called War of the Jews, or Jewish War. And it came out right here at the same time in the 70s AD, mid-70s AD. To great fanfare, endorsed strongly by Titus. And this is a history of this war. But if you read it alongside the Gospels, then with the proper lenses on your glasses, then you can see the abundant parallels between War of the Jews and the New Testament, especially the Gospels, and especially the Gospel of Luke. Michael Menescotz, in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, dug into the book of Luke, specifically looking for parallels from War of the Jews. And he found over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. That's 10 per chapter, over 10 per chapter. And many of those parallels are quite strong, with a number of different motifs matching in each one. And what you can glean from these different parallels is that there is great intentionality behind them. You can see this kind of the signature of the Romans in them, meaning that a lot of the parallels are literally dripping with hatred for the Jews and ridicule, mocking, demeaning, degrading the Jews. And really, also some of these things may have been targeted toward the Roman soldiers and Roman slaves as well. But in particular, the Jews grasp a lot of the hatred that's coming from the Romans. Menescotz also took those 250 parallels and he graphed them on a chart. Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every place he found a parallel, he plotted a point. After plotting 250 points, he had formed 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the other language of the Roman Caesars, APTVS. So Titus and Vespasian are in there. There may have been other authors as well, but the main point is that the Romans literally signed their names to the book of Luke, or at least their initials on the book of Luke, so that one day we would eventually discover their dastardly deed. And that's coming right now. That's happening right now. Now, there has been a smattering of people who have understood this all throughout history, but it's coming more like a faucet at this point, or it will be. If I have anything to do with it, at least. And there are many different themes and parallels of the parallels and parodies between Josephus and the Gospels. Joseph Atwill, in his 2005 book, Caesar's Messiah, found, especially the more recent edition called the Flavian Signature, found over 40 cases of parallels between Jesus's ministry and Titus's military campaign. Jesus's ministry is just a parody of Titus's military campaign. Every place that Jesus goes, every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. And they go to these different places in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced by 40 years. Where whenever Jesus does something, it is 40 years earlier than wherever Titus does something, because the Romans backdated the story of the Gospels by 40 plus years. They wrote them in the 70s, but they set the story in the late 20s and early 30s AD. And there are many other sets of parallels, a set of kind of triangulated parallels between the book of Exodus, chapter 12, and the Gospels and War of the Jews, talking about the Passover lamb. Exodus 12 gives you the instructions for how to do the Passover lamb ritual, and then both Josephus and the Gospels demonstrate that these strictures given in Exodus 12 are followed to the letter by the events in those books, showing that, well, you know, the Passover lamb has to have no blemishes. The Passover lamb, you have to not break its legs. You have to roast it over a fire. You have to wear shoes while you're doing it, and all this kind of crazy OCD kind of stuff that you know, the OCD God Yahweh is put on his people in Exodus is being transferred over to the Roman time period here, and they follow these strictures to the letter as a mockery. Many other mockeries and so on. And so those things are for you to check out. I've gone through all of those parallels in previous videos that you can go through. And I will be going over, we're going to be doing, it probably won't be coming up for a couple months, but we're going to be going over the book of Luke, specifically word by word, and calling out all of the things that need to be decoded from the book of Luke. So you can't say that I'm just shooting from the hip. I'm going directly from the scriptures in order to debunk all of this and show that it is a massive psychological operation, probably the greatest in all of history. Now, what we're looking at today is an adjacent study that was done by Robert Eisenman, who's one of the authors who's probably most famous for kind of forcing the Dead Sea Scrolls to finally get translated and disseminated to scholars. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s and 50s at Qumran near Jerusalem, and they are a treasure trove of texts, the oldest existing versions of many of the Old Testament texts. There's like 20 versions of Genesis and 25 versions of Isaiah and so on and so forth. I think every single Old Testament book is represented except for maybe the book of Esther. And but there is also a lot of sectarian material, which is the most important stuff, because there was a sect of very pious Jewish kind of monks living there at Qumran, and they put together books like the Community Rule, the War Scroll, the Temple Scroll, the Damascus Document. These are things that were kind of how the rules of their particular sect. And you can see kind of the daily, day-to-day of this group of this sect of pious Jews, and you can kind of see what mattered to them and what was important, what was going on. And they also told a story that featured really three characters, possibly two. The one is the teacher of righteousness, and then there is also the wicked priest, and then there also is the liar. And so since then, scholars have been trying to figure out who is who when they're trying to pair it up with the New Testament scripts. Is Jesus the teacher of righteousness, or is it John the Baptist, or is it Jesus's brother James? And then who is the wicked priest? Is that Caiaphas, or is that John the Baptist, or who is it? And then who is the liar? Is that Paul? And so these are questions that need to be asked. It might not be any of the above. That might be completely irrelevant to the whole gospel story, because as we know, the gospel story was fabricated at a later date. Now, the date of the Qumran manuscripts is also called into question. Some scholars believe it was as early as the 2nd century BC, but I think most scholars believe that they were written in the 1st century AD, right about the same time as all of these gospel hijinks were going on. So Eisenman has a book here that's called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, which has a number of his earlier articles and a couple of his shorter books all in it. And we're reading chapter 4 article called Paul as Herodian. And so this, Eisenman could clearly smell a rat when he's reading over the New Testament. Why is Paul so freaking deferential to the Romans and so freaking anti-Jewish? And I guess since Eisenman is Jewish, he might have had even more of a reaction to that. But so now he's trying to put together all of the evidence, painstaking detective work of piecing together one clue here, one clue there, and one clue over there, where he figures out that Paul is a member of the Herod dynasty of puppets of the Caesars. And it's very interesting because many of the people that Paul shouts out in the book of Acts and in Pauline epistles are in fact either Herods, Herodians, or even Caesars, even Flavians. Paul is buddy-buddy with all of these people. That's why we went over the book previous to this, which was called Operation Messiah, where those authors, Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon, they conclude that Paul is actually an intelligence agent of the Romans and that he was a spy, and he faked his conversion on the road to Damascus in order to infiltrate the Nazarene movement of the James and the brother of Jesus and Peter, Simon Peter. Okay, let's start out with this Eisenman here. Where Paul is concerned, one can only cite his cordial relations with Roman governors and Herodians generally, plus the notices at the end of Romans and Philippians. Whatever the conclusion here, the parallels, including the names themselves, are very striking, and the coincidences broad. Though none of this information is precise or secure enough to draw any final or firm conclusions, it does nonetheless raise interesting questions and opens new directions not heretofore explored. We do not deny that Paul considered himself Jewish, whatever his definition of this might have been. So did Herodians generally, though this confidence does not seem to have been shared by the populace at large, and certainly not by the extremists. This is precisely the point of departure of the so-called Zealot movement, Therefore, it is zealot in the matter of Phineas, Ezekiel, and Ezra in terms of removing foreigners from the Israelite camp, temple, or community. In Ezekiel 44:3 through 15, this idea is expressed prior to defining who the sons of Zadok were, so important for the exegetes at Qumran. Now, Zadok was the priest of David or Solomon, and then his descendants, were the sons of Zadok. The previous priesthood had polluted itself by admitting foreigners into the temple. Ezekiel even sets forth requirements so stringent that they are applicable to backsliding Jews as well as foreigners. No one uncircumcised in heart or body shall be admitted into the temple. Not only is this the phraseology applied to the wicked priest in the Habakkuk Pesher, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, when discussing the problems of pollution of the temple and his disqualification from temple service. It is also the imagery seized upon by Paul when he compares his teaching with the teaching of the law in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 3 above. That is, you are Christ's letter, served by us, not written with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, such as the Ten Commandments, but on the fleshy tablets of the heart. These themes of disqualification from the temple and pollution are also picked up in the temple scroll, where their ramifications are delineated amid long passages about what was expected of the king. They are also to be found in the Damascus document, where they are related to the problem, as we have seen, of improper separation of clean and unclean in the temple. In our view, this theme of improper separation includes the one of foreigners, a theme directed, among other things, against Herodians, and the pollution engendered by association with them. Anyone who approaches them not being free of their pollution, in column 6 of the Damascus document, either by receiving the priesthood from them or the consonant reception of their gifts and sacrifices in the temple. Those we have called Nazarite zealots, who mob Paul in the temple and unceremoniously deposit him outside, it should be remarked that preceding this in Acts 21:20, James's followers are called all zealots for the law, like Phineas and the practitioners of the not one jot or tittle approach to the law in James 2:11, and at Qumran do not, quote, seek smooth things, quote, unquote. Namely, they do not seek accommodation with foreigners on the key issues we have been signaling: foreign kingship, foreign appointment of high priests, divorce, marriage with nieces, sacrifice, and gifts from foreigners in the temple, etc. It is in a context of this kind that Paul takes on something of the character of the stalking horse we have mentioned above. We have for the Herodian family. In our view, what he is doing in his last trip to Jerusalem, despite warnings not to go, as Acts depicts in 21:4, is testing the ban on various classes of foreigners, particularly Herodians, in the temple, and their other relationships to the temple. Though matters such as these are not really capable of proof to everyone's satisfaction, still no other explanations better explain the combination of events we are witnessing. One thing cannot be denied. Paul's Herodian connections make the manner of his sudden appearances and disappearances, his various miraculous escapes, his early power in Jerusalem while still a young man, his Roman citizenship, his easy relations with Herodian kings and Roman governors, and the venue and terms of his primary missionary activities in Asia Minor and then in Corinth and Rome, comprehensible in a manner no other reconstruction approaches. When it comes to linking the thrust of these testimonies and allusions to the political life setting of later Qumran sectarian sects and the references to the genre of lying spouter contained in them, much good sense can also be achieved, but this is perforce beyond the scope of our present treatment in this paper. Okay, that's the end of the article. It's kind of a sudden ending, but the basic idea is that, what's up with Paul? There's so many red flags in the book of Acts with Paul. Paul gets arrested by the Roman. Every place that Paul goes, he starts a riot. The Jews try to kill him, and he is saved by the Romans. The Romans put him under, quote, protective custody. So he is under arrest by the Romans, but at the same time, the Roman guards let him give a speech when he's under arrest. He giving a speech to other people, to his people in the audience. When does that happen? What is that all about? And there are just many events that make absolutely no sense in the Pauline epistles. To me, the Gospels are one thing, but to go along with the Pauline epistles is just ridiculous. It has no. The guy never encountered Jesus in his life. He hobnobs with Romans and Herodians all the time, and he then has his conversion experience on the road to Damascus, and he's with a bunch of persecutors, because Paul was a persecutor of Jesus' followers. And then he has his conversion experience, and all of his other persecutors that he's with just kind of let him go. That's not reality. This is so far detached from reality that, I can understand if you want to believe in this as a term, as maybe some kind of mythology or something, but when you get into the text that you just follow exactly what it says, especially when there's absolutely no evidence for it. All of the evidence that supports